Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Singapore as a guest of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, an institution where I have many friends and for which I have great admiration. And it's a particular honor for me to be asked to deliver the third annual S.T. Lee Lecture. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Barry Desker for inviting me, my old friend Yun Fung Kong for his kind words of introduction, and most of all, Dr. Lee himself for his generosity in sponsoring this event and for the vision that he's shown in supporting higher education around the world, including in my own country. I've been asked to discuss some of the main themes of my book, A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia. And it is perhaps especially fitting that I should do this here in Singapore because, in fact, the book's title is taken from a 2009 interview with Lee Kuan Yew in which he advised Americans that, quote, "The 21st century will be a contest for supremacy in the Pacific. If you do not hold your ground in the Pacific, you cannot be a world leader." And I believe that in this, as in many other matters, the former minister mentor is correct. If I had to sum up the message of the book in a few sentences, I would do so in the following way. The United States and China are today, in fact, engaged in an intense geopolitical rivalry. This rivalry has a number of dimensions: economic, diplomatic, as well as military. It's been going on for some time. Indeed, I would say it has been underway since the end of the Cold War. And it's likely to grow more intense and probably more dangerous in the years immediately ahead. And what I would like to do this afternoon is to say more about the forces that are shaping the evolving relationship between the United States and China, then to discuss the strategies that the two states have devised for dealing with one another and to offer an assessment of the current state of their rivalry. And I'd like to close by offering some thoughts on the events that have occurred since the book was finished at the end of 2010 and what these events may portend for the future. The Sino-American relationship today is obviously mixed. It contains elements of cooperation as well as competition. I think most observers would agree with this statement, although they might differ in their assessments of the relative proportions of cooperation and competition. This mixed relationship is the product of an array of contending forces, some of them tending to promote competition and others to encourage cooperation. And among those that have been described as being in the latter category are the pursuit of economic gain, a shared desire to avoid the costs and risks of confrontation, the presumed existence of common interests on a variety of issues, proliferation, terrorism, climate change, which should provide the basis for convergent policies, and the socializing effects, especially on China, of participation in multilateral international institutions. Of these factors, I think the first two, the desire for profits and the fear of conflict, have thus far been the most important. On closer inspection, it turns out that the issues on which the United States and China truly have convergent interests are relatively few. And even some of the areas that have long been seen as essentially cooperative have emerged more recently as sources of significant friction. And I'm thinking here particularly of the trade relationship. I'm inclined to be quite skeptical of the claim that institutional participation is producing or has yet produced any fundamental change in the way in which China's leaders think about and interact with the outside world. To the extent that China has chosen to participate in various institutions and to accept certain norms of international behavior, it appears to have done so out of a calculation of the relationship between its interests and its relative power. And as China grows stronger, I think we're going to see its behavior change. If cooperation is relatively superficial, the sources of Sino-American competition are, by contrast, in my view, deeply rooted. Contrary to what is often said, the competitive tendencies that we see are not merely the results of misperception or of readily correctable policy errors, although these certainly contribute at times. Rather, they spring from two sources. First is the age-old dynamics of power politics. The narrowing gap in wealth and power between a dominant state and a fast-rising potential challenger has historically been a formula for tension and rivalry, if not always for war. And it's easy to see why. Dominant powers tend to want to protect their privileges, and they tend to fear that rising powers aim to displace them. Rising powers, for their part, typically chafe at institutional structures, hierarchies of prestige, and often territorial boundaries that were put in place when they were relatively weak. Rising powers tend to want their place in the sun, and they tend to fear that the dominant power or powers are intent on frustrating and perhaps even crushing them. The second factor, I think, driving the competitive aspects of the relationship is ideology. There is a deep and persistent divergence in ideology and institutional structures between the United States and China. And one often hears it said that because China is no longer truly a communist country, there's no basis for an ideological rivalry with the United States. It may be true that China's leaders are no longer Marxists, but they are still Leninists. They believe in the continued rule of China's Communist Party, and they believe that it's essential to their country's future, and they're determined to maintain it. And they regard the United States as a crusading ideological nation that wants to see them eventually displaced from power. And as it happens, they're essentially right. Meanwhile, for their part, the American people and their elected representatives are reluctant to trust a regime that they believe suppresses dissent, outlaws meaningful political competition, and strictly regulates the practice of religion. And in my opinion, these misgivings, too, are well placed. So my bottom line projection or prediction would be that if we stay on the trajectory that we're currently following, and for many reasons we may not, in other words, if China continues to grow richer and stronger, but if it continues to be ruled by a one-party authoritarian regime, the competitive aspects of its relationship with the United States are going to expand, and the cooperative aspects, while they may persist in some areas, are going to dwindle even further. Now, I should emphasize that I don't think this means conflict between the United States and China is inevitable. I don't. But I do think that growing tension and heightened rivalry almost certainly are. To deal with this mixed relationship, the United States has developed a mixed strategy. That strategy has evolved over time since the early 1990s, but I would argue that it's proven thus far to be quite stable. It's persisted across Republican and Democratic administrations. The George H.W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, George W. Bush, and now the Obama administration, I think have followed an approach to dealing with China which is more similar than different over time. Now, this strategy has never been codified in an official document like NSC 68 at the beginning of the Cold War. Instead, its various parts have grown organically over time. And I would say it consists of two elements. The first is what's generally referred to as engagement. Engagement through trade, diplomacy, scientific, cultural, educational exchange, and so on. And in many respects, this is a continuation and an intensification of some aspects of the policy that the United States pursued towards China during the second half of the Cold War. The engagement part of U.S. strategy, I think, has two basic objectives. And although American policymakers would not use the words that I'm going to use to describe them, I think nonetheless that they're accurate. The first goal is, in a sense, to tame China, to encourage it to become what in the previous U.S. administration was referred to as a responsible stakeholder in the international system, to give it a reason to want to uphold that system, to recognize that it benefits from the persistence of that system rather than in any way to challenge it. So that's the first goal. And the second goal, truly, although it's not typically openly discussed, is, in fact, over time, to encourage the transformation of China, to encourage liberalizing political tendencies that will lead ultimately to fundamental political reform in China, not as a result of any direct American action, but in particular through the pursuit of engagement, economic engagement, promoting economic growth, presumably leading to the rise of the middle class, which has historically been the standard bearer of democratic reforms. So that's the first part of U.S. strategy, engagement. The second part is what I would refer to as balancing. Since the mid-1990s, I think starting with the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1995-96, the United States has also taken deliberate steps intended to maintain a favorable balance of power in East Asia. It's bolstered its air and naval capabilities in this part of the world. It's maintained and indeed sought to strengthen its relations with its treaty allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, among them. And it has also built a number of what I would call quasi-alliance partnerships with other countries, countries to whom the United States does not extend a defense commitment, but with whom it shares a concern about the possible implications of China's rising power. And I would include in this category Singapore, with whom the United States has had an increasingly close and cooperative strategic relationship since the early 1990s, and also, more recently, India, with which the United States has developed also a quasi-alliance partnership, began to take shape in the late 1990s, and has grown considerably wider and deeper since then. And there are many reasons for that, but I would say principal among them is a shared concern about the growth of Chinese power. And the goal of this balancing part of American strategy, again, largely unspoken, is essentially to hold the ring, to maintain stability, to preserve the status quo while engagement works its magic on China, however long that takes.